name's Dane Hillard. I am a one and a half time author with Manning, I guess. So I've written one book with them, Practices of the Python Pro, which is a light introduction to software design and extensibility concepts with Python examples. And then I am working on a new book with them called Publishing Python Packages, all about sort of a maintainable, repeatable process with authoring packages in Python. So, and sort of on my day-to-day job, I work on web applications at Ithaca on the JSTOR website. How about you, Ruben?
I had no idea you were working on that new book on packaging. Wow, that is so needed. Okay, I'm gonna ask you more about that in a little bit. I'm gonna take advantage of this. So my name is Reuven Lerner. I have my own consulting business for about 25 years now. And I'm a full-time Python trainer. So just about every day I'm with a different company, city, country, used to be physically, now it's online, teaching Python, everything from Python for non-programmers all the way up to advanced Python workshops. And I also have written, well, I'll be generous and say it's 1.5 books. There's the one book that I've actually written, Python Workout, right next to me here conveniently for showing to everyone. And then which is 50 exercises, which is a lie. It's really 200 exercises, but we call it 50 because it's smaller, less scary number. Exercises to help you improve your Python fluency. And I'm working now on the Pandas workout, which is strangely 50 exercises disguising 200 exercises to help you improve your Pandas fluency. And I just earlier today got about halfway through chapter 3. I'm super excited. And hopefully it'll be up at the MEEP, the early action program. I'm guessing another 2-3 months, although my editors will laugh at that, with at least a few initial chapters. So what did we decide to call this session? I think it's like the expanding world of Python. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. This might come as no surprise to like anyone watching this. Python is like ridiculously, crazy, outrageously, like explosively popular nowadays. How long have you been using Python? Like quite a while also, yeah?
Yeah, I started using it either as part of or on the side of my previous job. So it's been at least 7 years and probably longer than that by a couple of years. So almost 10 years now.
Okay. So yeah, so I started using Python back in like 1993, and like, you learned it from the man page and like the tutorial, and it was like a few people who used it. And then it like got more and more and more popular. I think in many ways is like other high-level languages sort of died out for various reasons or didn't gain popularity. And now it's like hard to find a company organization that does not want to use Python, which by the way is like great for business. But the thing is like, so where is Python not now? And where does it seem to be going is I guess where we should start off.
Yeah, for sure. And you dated yourself, so I'll date myself too. Fun fact for me is that the first release of Python came out the month I was born.
Okay, well, we know who's old here.
Yeah, 1989. So, I mentioned that I do web application development, and it's kind of interesting because one space for sure that is kind of controversial, I guess, or lots of discussions happening about it is in the web space, right? And part of the challenge there is, of course, that JavaScript is the ubiquitous language of the web, and has been for a long time. But with recent advances with WebAssembly and things like that, right, you have new vectors to kind of get into that space with, and there are a couple things in Python aiming to do just that, but it is still maybe one of the more fledgling areas.
And that would mean what? So like, if I understand correctly, and I haven't really followed this that closely, but if I understand correctly, WebAssembly is sort of like almost like a machine language or assembly language that sits in the browser. And so if you have something that compiles to WebAssembly, then it can run the browser also, just like JavaScript. Did I get that roughly right?
That's my understanding too. Yeah. So there are a couple of projects. Brython is one that I know of, and Pyodide is another project that seeks to target WebAssembly. And yeah, I think the idea is like you could use Python as your interface to the web to interact with the page document object model and anything that JavaScript can do. There are a couple projects, and maybe, I don't know, maybe Python is one of them, where it kind of emulates how JavaScript is with how it interacts with the document model. And I've seen that some people don't like that as much and would prefer to, kind of repeat the domain specific language part in a more Pythonic way rather than kind of emulating JavaScript. But yeah, again, it's like super early stages for some of that stuff, and I don't know a lot about it either. I haven't explored it in depth.
Fascinating. I'll say, like, so I was back there when, like, the web started and did some stuff at that time, and I was also at the unveiling of Java as a language back in New York City in 1995, and that's because of that, like a whole marketing to do. That's why they called JavaScript, like to match up with the Java language. In any event, at that time, there was actually some talk about having other languages do it as well. And there was like a plugin for Python, and that went exactly nowhere. So, it's nice to know it's actually going somewhere. That's very impressive. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, what about like everyone's favorite platform nowadays, which is mobile? Like, and again, I'm kind of ignorant on that, but I know that there are a whole bunch of people who are like trying to get it to work.
Yeah. Again, there's I think a couple projects in that space, but certainly I haven't seen a ton that are taking off, I would say. I think with some languages, you have mobile targeting frameworks that work with your preferred framework to kind of just get it out the door automatically with React Native, and I think Python would need something of that sort of nature to really get people curious enough and sort of excited enough to jump on board in a way that would reach critical mass. Beware is a project that people, the tagline is sort of like, write Python, run it anywhere. I don't know if I got that verbatim, but the idea being that you can write the code that you're used to and target it to a number of platforms with minimal sort of additional legwork on your part. So Beware has a thing called Briefcase that's trying to target OS native applications. So I think that's Mac OS and iOS at least. I think there's also some Windows stuff in there. So that one's kind of interesting. I know nothing about mobile development, generally speaking. I think I did like one Android project quite some time ago, before Python for sure.
So I use a Mac. I've been using a Mac for a number of years. I mean, behind me you can see an old Mac, which I did not use, and the next to is a Next machine, which I did use so many years ago. And so I'm very comfortable with, like, the Mac and Unixy stuff. And so people were very surprised that I got an Android phone. And the reason was very simple. I was like, well, because I want to use Python to program my phone. And I don't know, I've had an Android phone for like 8-10 years now, and I've yet to write even a single line of anything having to do with Android development, because I actually am busy with other things. Even though I keep saying, I really should do this, I really should learn this. And I keep seeing the Beware stuff. There's also something called Kivy, which I don't know much about, that I know also sort of allows you to write in Python and work on your phone. And it seems to me like this has to be, like, the folks who are working on these projects, they understand, like, everything is mobile now. And if you're not on mobile, then, like, you basically don't exist, or there's no way to keep up that momentum. So it's impressive to see, like, the demos I've seen have been very impressive. I don't quite get how they get it to work on iOS, given that's supposed to be this closed ecosystem. But it seems that they are able to do that. So, like, kudos to them on that.
Yeah. Hey, Curious Dev Cookie, welcome. Yeah, I forgot about Kivy. I have heard of that one too, for sure. What's interesting too is, I guess, that mobile and the web are slowly converging, right? There's this idea of progressive web apps, and they provide almost a native-like experience, and they give ways to do things when the user is offline, and do data syncing between offline and online states. So I wonder if, as Python looks to target WebAssembly, if that narrative will also kind of come into the picture. And maybe it is now.
I'm sure. Like you're right. Like, you know, back in olden times when I was doing web application development, like we didn't even think about such things. But nowadays we have such sophisticated stuff going on. Like if you're disconnected from the network and you're writing into your Google Docs document, you want it to say, "Hey, I'm disconnected. I'm going to cache this locally, and then when I reconnect, I'm going to send it up to the network." And so presumably, like Python's going to have to be able to do that to be taken seriously. And if it can do it easily and nicely, which is sort of a hallmark of the language, then that's gonna, you know, that'll really push things ahead.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a vanilla spirited functional web programmer, as I don't see the point in frameworks yet. Progressive web apps, because platform agnostic, with native web components for encapsulation and nicely structured code, SVG, CSS grid. Yeah. Yeah, this idea of how what, curious dev cookie. I think your point about native web components for encapsulation, we're actually doing that on a project at work too, and I agree. This idea of encapsulation, generally speaking, and getting all of the behavior and data that you need pulled into one space is a generally good software design pattern. So, you're asking like how is Python gonna attack all of that stuff? That's a very good question. I don't think I know the answer to that.
I think they're trying to like I mean, all the Python stuff that I've seen so far has been, you know, what we call backend, right? That anything you're going to do front end wise, it's basically the Python is producing, copying, outputting HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And so in order for it to be like smarter on the front end, you're going to have some sort of either like what Dane was describing, where it's going to be Python in WebAssembly, like on the front end, they're communicating somehow, or it's going to be like, well, I mean, then we'll just like, it'll be producing it from that back end, and you'll need to know another language of some sort, which is sort of the way it works now. And I don't know if the frameworks are even thinking that in that direction. I think for now, at least the stuff that I've seen, they're still assuming JavaScript, CSS, and HTML are where it's at. If that's going to change, it's going to change slowly. It's still so much shocking to me, like to see how incredibly pervasive JavaScript is. But that's just like the nature of the world. But sometimes these standards get entrenched, regardless of what our, shall we say, aesthetic sense might prefer. There's actually a fantastic article written years and years ago called "Worse is Better." I want to say that it's by Richard Gabriel. And basically, he was one of these old-time Lisp hackers who was bemoaning the fact that Unix took over the world, and Unix is written in C. And how can anyone take seriously anything that's written in C because it's such a terrible language? And yet he says basically, because the C programmers were not perfectionists, because they were realists, and because they weren't jerks to everyone around them, Lisp went nowhere, and C went everywhere. And you know, that's why we're not all programming our Lisp machines nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point too about HTML, JavaScript, CSS sort of being the transport language, almost transport data type of getting things onto the web. I do see some kind of shift. There's this idea of the jam stack, right, which is JavaScript APIs and markup, and the transport language there. The popular one right now is like GraphQL, right? And there are Python implementations of GraphQL, and I actually wrote a blog post recently about like using Django and Vue and communicating between those with GraphQL. So there's still there is this still like continuing picture of Python as a backend language, and just what's changing is like how you're transporting that information, right? And there's a couple popular frameworks still for REST APIs, of course. Django REST framework was a big popular one for a long time. Fast API is a relative newcomer in that space that people enjoy a lot. And a lot of those also have this kind of idea of static typing as a guardrail attached to them, which I think is pretty interesting. I thought it was Guido that I saw recently talking about, Python and TypeScript borrowing from each other, different ideas.
Or each other, because my impression was it was very like unidirectional, that basically Python said, TypeScript, that's a great idea, we're doing that. And very interesting. I mean, I must admit, I've been using dynamic languages for so many years that I was definitely on the side of the fence where people would say, well, why don't you have any type declarations? And I'd be like, type declarations? Who needs those? Those are for wimps, for bad programmers. And besides, look how few bugs we have, and it's all great. And I have become convinced that actually maybe that's fine if you have 2 or 3 Uber hackers working on something and in the same room. But the moment that you have 100 people working on a large project and they're not all reading the documentation and they have to get things to work, and like it's $1 billion company at stake, maybe some, as you call them, guardrails are not a bad thing. And I've even seen a lot of people in my courses who come from static languages feel more comfortable, feel calmer about using Python if they can use type hints. So I think type hints are like, I'm surprised. I'm surprised by how much I like them and how much people are adopting them. And I don't know if it'll ever be part of the core language, but the use of them seems just to be growing and growing and growing. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yep, I totally agree. We've sort of seen that they benefit us both from that safety perspective, and also there's a bit of a developer experience aspect to it too, right? If your IntelliSense tooling can pick up on those, you can generally also code a bit faster, or at least maintain better context while you're coding. And you could get that to some degree without type hints too, right? I think a lot of tools would pick up on what's the word I'm looking for? Doc strings. Sorry, if you had a particular convention in your doc strings for your arguments that specified types, you could get it that way too. But having it in some way that feels a little more integrated into the language, even if it's not part of the core language, starts to feel a little more like an ecosystem, right?
Yeah, I definitely see like more people using it, demanding it, and it's funny. Like, I mean, I use Jupyter most days for my teaching, and Jupyter does not have any sort of MyPy or type hints things. So on occasion, if I'm using say PyCharm, and I'll often like write code and say, oh, this is probably going to work, right? And then I'll run and say, oh no, it doesn't work. What do you know? And basically, like PyCharm completely steals the thunder on that, because it highlights the thing that I typed. Like, it doesn't let me basically surprise people, because people will be like, hey, look, that's like in a brown background, so like that's not going to work. So I mean, that's good for it shows basically that it is catching these things very well. I've even heard people say like, maybe we don't need to document as much, because instead of having your doc string where you're going to describe what you expect to have in things, it's just right there. It's like machine readable, so it's good for the machine and good for people as well.
Agreed. You should still always document for the reasons you should document to explain the why and the thinking, right? So you asked what the thingy strings are that I mentioned. Doc strings is what I said. It's Curious Def Cookie. They're the strings you define immediately after an opening of a class or a function that various tools will pull in when building documentation or anything like that, and they're available on that class or function object as the dunder doc attribute, I think. So you were talking about Jupyter, Ruben. That's like starts to get into the data science field of Python. I think that's very interesting to talk about too.
Oh my God. It's like, it's fascinating to see that too. Cause like that sort of came, on the one hand, it came out of nowhere, right? Like that suddenly everyone and their brother is doing data science. And of course they're gonna use Python for it. But it's like, you know, it's sort of the 10-year overnight success that because people were working for a long time on NumPy, then Pandas was possible. And then Pandas was possible, like Pandas made other things possible. And now, right, you have this whole amazing ecosystem. And I find that like when I teach data science courses, it's two different groups of people. It's the programmers who don't know statistics and analysis, but it's the analysts who don't know programming. And especially for that latter group, the fact that Python is easy to learn, consistent, you know, sort of friendly to work with, just sort of makes it really easy for them to slide in and start doing that sort of work. So it's become crazy, crazy, crazy popular, and it just sort of builds on itself. So when I was doing my dissertation a number of years ago, like I wanted to use Python for the analysis, and I was told you can't, like the libraries just are not good enough. And nowadays, I don't think anyone would say that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you know, what you just mentioned is part of what generally makes Python such a broadly used language in any field. And I've always felt this sense that as a programmer, I have this ability too, which is that programming is always secondary to some other objective, right? The programming is a means to an end, which is to support some kind of business model, right? And so being a programmer, it's actually really interesting to get into these different fields where you can learn about biotechnology or bioinformatics or data science or the web, and having that almost as a set of secondary disciplines, right, is really interesting. And Python specifically, I think, because of its accessibility and because of its ease of learning, really supports that idea at the programming language level.
Absolutely. No, people are using it for all sorts of stuff, and it's easy for them to do that. Oh, here, I'll answer our question. Our most prolific questioner so far, Curious Dev Cookie. So my dissertation, very, very briefly, because, you know, I spent 11 years on it. If you ever think about doing a PhD, talk to me first, and I will convince you out of it. In any event, it was in a program called Learning Sciences, which is a combination of computer science and cognitive science and design in an education school at Northwestern. And basically my specific group worked on what's called agent-based modeling, like creating simulations of typically science and math and nature using all these different agents. And it was using a version of Logo, like the language you might have heard of that kids use, but with many, many, many turtles. And so my particular dissertation was writing a collaborative framework or a web application that allowed people to collaboratively create simulations, create models. Sort of like, you can think of it like a Wikipedia for articles. This was the analogous thing for simulations. And it took me a crazy long time to do the PhD. I got up by the skin of my teeth. I still can't believe that I have this like diploma on the wall. I keep it guarded, you know, carefully because, you know, in case my advisor ever has regrets. But to my great pleasure, like hundreds of people still use my dissertation software every day. Like it's the largest repository of agent-based models in NetLogo. And yeah, so like it's actually practical. What do you know? And so, and it's great fun, like looking back, not then, but looking back, that I really did learn a lot in many, many ways.
The other thing that strikes me too about this like broad use of Python, right, is that packaging is the way we share software generally. And you know, you can post your source code on GitHub, I suppose. And I feel especially in academia, that is how you would do it, or you would, you know, post it somewhere that's available online and link to that in your methods, right? But packaging is sort of the way that you would share code if you hope others it. and packaging, coincidentally, is one of the most sort of troubled histories of Python. Like it's the thing people always tend to groan about, sort of as a, this doesn't have a good story around it, or
so it's not just me, right? Like for years, I was like, I don't understand. Everything in Python is like so easy and straightforward and obvious. And you want to publish something to PyPI, you want to like deal with PyPI. It's like, what a mess. I mean, I recently, I guess like a year or so ago, discovered poetry, which has completely upended my world in a positive way. That suddenly, like, there's a normal way for me to like create a distribution, make it available to others, publish it. I mean, just the mere fact that we use package to mean two different things is like enough to drive you to distraction. So really, like, tell us about your book, because like I could have used it a few years ago before like losing a few many hours of sleep.
Sure. I mean, the idea is that it has been an evolving, moving target, if you will, right? There's been, and I'm not even going to go as far back as I could on this, but there's been distutils, setup tools. There's been eggs. There's been wheels. So there's been multiple tools to support packaging. There's been multiple formats of packages, distribution formats. There's been multiple tools to manage your packages in your project. And they've all had their own quirks at one time or another. So like just keeping track even of all of that can be difficult. And then like making sure you're using it right can be difficult. And I think like I'm hoping in this book to clarify a lot of those topics, and sort of get at the fundamentals of what they're trying to do. And then, there's been some recent standardization around some of those. There's been PEPs pointing at this topic. So PEP 517 is a big one. And poetry, setup tools. Flit is another packaging tool that's gaining some popularity. The standardization there is that they kind of define a build backend and a build front end, and the backend's job is to actually do the packaging. The front end's job is to provide a command line interface, or some sort of interface to the author, and then they'll ultimately all seek to build source distributions or wheel distributions in a standardized way. And there's even from the packaging authority, a sort of reference fully compliant build tool called Build, that does this too. So hoping to just kind of discuss all of that, give people the fundamentals and some specific implementations, and give sort of like a path to building comfort and confidence with all of that, because it's sure to continue evolving, right? Even and the standard specifically kind of gives room for there to be more tools in this space, specifically. So
but we've seen a lot of improvement in PyPI and in pip over the last, let's call it 3 to 4 years. Like it's a sea change. So that's great. And I guess like they're now saying, okay, we need to think about this as an ecosystem. We need to think about this as like something that's going to move forward and evolve. What's the smartest way for us to plan this as opposed to just sort of like jury rig it together?
Right. And there's also been some grants. Bloomberg and Microsoft, I think, have both bestowed some money in this direction. One, I think, specifically to hire a product manager in that space for the PSF, to kind of focus on this, and then some dedicated time and money toward doing the actual development and whatnot. So I think that's really good. I think some people question corporations getting involved with their wallets too heavily in certain parts of the infrastructure, but you need sometimes that scale to drive big change and provide the resources, certainly. So it's good to see that people are thinking about that.
Look, I'm glad there's some skepticism. It's always good to like think about it. At the same time, at the end of the day, like they can give money to whatever they want, but it's really like the core developers and the steering committee that are going to make decisions as to what goes in. And I know this is true for Postgres. I believe it's true in Python also that that there's some rules about how many people can work for the same organization. And even if that's not in there, like the elections make it more community based. And I mean, think of how many like billions and billions of dollars some of these companies, like you mentioned, Microsoft and Bloomberg, I think Google's given money as well. Like they're making hundreds of millions, billions of dollars using this sort of infrastructure. And we always say, gee, they should really give back. And it's so much more useful in many ways for them to give large grants of money for this PSF to hire someone they want to do whatever they want than to say, well, Joe over here, like he'll give you a day a week or a day every few weeks whenever he has time. Like this is, I think, a very good thing. And it's a good precedent also. In fact, I'm just remembering now, the whole reason the Apache Software Foundation was set up was because back in the day, IBM said, this HTTP server is really great. We want to give you some money. And the Apache developers said, give who money? It's just a bunch of us. And so they had to incorporate some sort of entity that then like the accountants would be happy. And so I don't know if the PSF started before or after, it must be after it, but regardless, like that provides the sort of community cover and checks and balances to make sure it works okay. But I would love to see many companies. I do it on a very small scale, right? Like sponsoring Python through my consulting company, but like we're not exactly at the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars mark. But like if lots of companies did that, then I think Python would really have a lot of improvement. I'll give one example, which is in terms of speed. I know we like listed this and talked about it a little before, but like 20 years ago, JavaScript was laughably slow, except it was only, you're only laughing if you were looking at it from a pure computer science perspective. You were crying if you were actually using it in your browser or trying to develop things. And basically Google came and said, we're going to invest incredible amounts of money in this language. And they did. And now JavaScript is ridiculously fast. And so there's no reason why without, if people were to contribute that sort of money to the PSF, I think Python could equally, sort of improve.
Yeah, I want to touch more on that topic because I think there's some interesting things in that space. But I have another question from Curious Dev Cookie in the meantime. And I think it's a good one. So what do you both think of the trend of people learning a framework and after that, if at all, learning the core language behind it? What are your thoughts about that? Is there some analog trend in Python? From my experience, I want to say that I almost got into Python through this route. It may not have been quite as order of operations black and white as that, but I remember kind of getting interested in Python through Django because I was doing a lot of side projecting earlier in my career to sort of gain chops, figure out what area I might want to continue my career in. And I do photography on the side, and I had written a photography website so people could, book sessions and stuff like that, which I could have, of course, done through WordPress or something like that, right? But I wanted to code it myself and get some practice. So I had done like a Java Spring website at one point, and I had done a PHP version at some point. And then I decided to try this thing called Django, and I was like, well, I guess I have to learn some Python to learn Django. But ultimately, I did learn it, and Python became maybe obviously now my favorite language to work in. I don't know. I can see frameworks being an entry point to learning a language like mine sort of was. I can also see the danger of only learning the framework and not the fundamentals. You see a lot of people say, learn the fundamentals first, which I tend lightly to agree with, but I don't know. I'm kind of on the argument that you should learn however works best for you.
So I'm going to disagree a bit there in that, I mean, like, I guess people at the end of the day, they're going to do what's best for them anyway, right? But like, I, I've encountered far, far, far too many people who have even been using Python for a year or two or three and somehow muddled through thanks to Stack Overflow and copying and pasting and rejiggering things because they just don't understand how the basics of the language work. I can understand dealing with a framework a bit more if you're talking about something like NumPy or Pandas, where you're not going to be using as much of the core Python, say, data structures and loops and so forth. Even there, you're going to benefit a lot from understanding how the core Python stuff works. But if you're doing something like web development, if you're doing like even day-to-day development with some sort of wrapper or framework, I think you cannot go wrong. In fact, it'll help you. It seems like as a burden. Oh God, I've got to do all this like stupid basic stuff before I can get to the advanced stuff. I sometimes comment like when I have my intro classes, some people will be like, "Oh, come on, we have to talk about these these basic data types. Can't we talk about real objects?" I say it's sort of like going to a chemistry class and saying, "Oh, we have to talk about elements. Can't we just talk about the real chemicals?" And it's like you can't get to the real chemicals if you don't understand the elements. So as like a hook to get people in, it obviously worked, right? Worked with you, Dane, and like works with other people, fine. But I don't think it's necessarily the way we should be aiming. I think we should try to get people the fundamentals so that when they get to the more advanced stuff, it'll fit into an existing, like it'll build on an existing infrastructure and conceptual framework, as opposed to, how does this work with that?
Yeah, and I think that's like the sensible side of that argument of learn the fundamentals first, for sure. It necessarily provides a foundation for that stuff, right? Where I feel like a framework can sometimes be a good entry point is, like I said earlier, like programming is always a means to an end, right? And if you decide maybe you want to try a framework, but you don't necessarily know the language, I think it's still okay to try and solve the problem with that framework without the core of the language behind it always. You can certainly run into trouble. There's certainly pitfalls along that route, right? And for me, I get maybe my mind works much more sort of as like an emergent education style where as soon as I see something I'm unfamiliar with, I will go and learn that thing and learn it pretty deeply if I can. I recognize not everyone works that way. So it could be, like you said, you could go a long time just kind of copying and pasting some things you see or hear without necessarily going into why they work, which I think presents trouble for sure. Yeah.
Here are more questions and comments from Curious Dev Cookie. So real objects. Oh, I was just talking about like people want to create. If you come from a strong object-oriented programming background, then you feel like, oh, I have a problem, so I'm going to create a new class. And if I'm not creating classes, then I'm not doing real programming. And like, what is it with like learning these basic classes like that are built into Python rather than going creating our own? But you can actually get very, very, very far in Python just using strings, lists, tuples, dictionaries, and the whole language is built out of it. I always like to say that Python uses Python to implement Python. Like you sort of peel back the hood on just about anything that's there, and there's like it's using those basic data structures. So yeah, we can create our own classes, but to focus on that before you get to the basics is, I think, a bit of a mistake, as my students discover. Are we allowed to force people to look under the hood when all they seem to do is want to play with a framework? Again, it can work. It can work, but at some point, something will like not work. And you're going to be really puzzled by why it doesn't work, I think in part because you don't understand how the basics work of the language. That said, look, I mean, my sort of obsession over the last few years has been attributes in Python, the stuff that comes after the dots. And I feel like I have to be this like evangelist for attributes because they can't evangelize for themselves. That if you don't understand how attributes work, you really miss a whole lot of how the language is implemented. And yet I survived perfectly well for, I don't know, let's say 15 years or so using Python before I really started to understand attributes in a serious way. So you can use a language without knowing that. But once you see it, you sort of can't unsee it. And then everything else makes much more sense.
It's attributes all the way down.
Yes, exactly.
So you had mentioned earlier on like the idea of performance and whatnot, and I think that's another space where Python is really expanding, and a lot of research and exploration is going into. Like Guido just announced kind of, I don't know if a roadmap is probably much too strong a word, but kind of his intent or desire to speed the language up by 2x in the next couple of years or something like that, which is just like a massive performance gain. And Python is always touted as a slow language, right? The answer to which is always like too slow for what exactly? But I think projects like PyPy and there's one called Pigeon. It's like a JIT compiler for Python. These projects are all trying to figure out ways to make the language faster, and my hope would be to see a lot of that coming back and being implemented into the reference implementation as much as possible. But each, of course, does have its limitations on why it can't, at least right now, be integrated into CPython. So that's an area I'm super excited to see over the next couple of years.
I agree. I mean, I've long said that Python is a great language for an age like ours, in which people are expensive and computers are cheap. And so nowadays, you want to fire up a VM, you want to fire up 100 VMs, go for it. It's going to cost you pennies, basically. And the really valuable bottleneck and resource is people. But that only goes, takes you so far. There are times when Python is just like slow. And I read that article. You referred me to it. I looked at the posting that Guido had set up, written about improving the speed. And it looks like he's pretty optimistic that we can get this done. There are some not too complex changes that they could make to the language that would be dramatically faster. And if they can pull that off, if they can double the speed, oh my God, it's going to get rid of a lot of naysayers. And I think it will attract even more people to the language who are currently sort of dithering over whether it's really appropriate or not because of this reputation and actual slowness. So no, that's really very, very cool.
Yeah, and I think as you seek to be competent in the web and mobile fronts, right? That sort of closer. It's of course always going to be slower than C, for example, right? But the closer you can get to that faster execution time, the more native apps will feel, and the more snappy your interface can be if it's built with Python. So. I like I said, I'm excited about it, I guess. And there was another thought I had on that, but I'm losing it now. I'm just in a constant state of losing it.
Join the club.
I'm trying to think if there are any other. So I remember it. I feel part of the thing that made this exploration of speeding up the language possible and also related to the new parser that they implemented.
Yes, you're right.
So this peg parser that they're using now, I think, at the very least, helps them iterate faster on changes, if not helping make the language faster. But I think we'll see sort of a velocity increase more and more on that. I know that it was added first and then sort of enabled later, I think. And now I think that's the parser being used directly. So cool. Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I mean, except to say, like, it continues to astonish me to see not just the number of people and the variety of projects that they're doing with Python nowadays, but the rate at which it continues to expand. It's just like really sort of overwhelming. And I think it was just like a sort of a small ragtag group a number of years ago, and now it's like basically everywhere. Everyone I know, they're like, oh, Python, of course I've heard of Python. Everyone's kids are learning Python in school and so forth. So if you're looking for a language to learn, Python is a great place to be, not just for now, but for the future, I'd say.
Yeah, my boss actually just told me her kid was in a summer program to learn Python, and he's like 13. Like, what was I doing at 13? I don't think I was writing Python, but yeah, and seeing microcontrollers and creative coding, people doing like live DJ sets with Python, all that stuff is just amazing. So I look forward to more of that intersectionality too, with sort of coding and art too.
Excellent. Well, this was great.
Yeah.
Fun talking to you. And thanks to everyone who was tuning in and submitting questions.
Yeah. Very fun chat. Thanks, Ruben.
Talk to you soon, Dave.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.